Let's now immediately apply what you just learned here in coding challenge number 3. And in this one, I want you to use a constructor function to implement an electric car class. So a class that should be called EV and which will be a child class of the car class that we created in the first challenge. So in the first challenge, you used a constructor function to create the car. And now here you're going to use the same technique to create the subclass. So basically the child class called EV. Okay? Now the EV, which stands for electric vehicle, by the way, also has a make and a current speed, of course, but it also has the current battery charge in percentage. And so that's here the charge property. And so here, in order to implement this child class, you will have to do exactly what we did in the last video. So basically connecting the two prototypes of these two constructors. Then on the EV class, I want you to implement a charge battery method, which takes in an argument called charge2, and it then simply sets the charge of the battery to that received value. Then also on this class, I want you to implement an accelerate method, which will increase the car speed by 20. And at the same time, it will also decrease the charge by 1%. And finally, this method should also print to the console a message like this. So the Tesla is going at 140 kilometers per hour with a charge of 22%. And that's Tesla here, because that's the test data that you're going to use here. So create an object based on this test data here, and then, just like before, experiment a little bit with the accelerate and the brake and also the charge battery methods. And one important thing that I want you to do is to notice what happens when you accelerate. All right, so review the definition of polymorphism that I gave you right in the first video of this section to make sense of this. So I hope that this is another fun challenge, and I see you here once you're finished. Okay, so let me start by getting the code that we wrote in the first challenge. So of course, there's no need to write it again. And so here goes my solution, which I hope you didn't need. But of course, it's always good to know how exactly I implemented it. So EV is this function, which has the same parameters as the car constructor. So that's the make and the speed, but then the additional property of charge. And so now, just like we did previously, we will not manually define the make and speed properties on the this keyword, but instead we will basically call the parent class. And so that's car.call, but with the this keyword that we are actually using in the EV. So we pass make and speed. And so again, this is exactly what we learned in the previous lecture. And then of course, we need to still set the speed. And now let's actually create the new car here. So the new object. So that's the new EV, Tesla going at 120, and the charge should start at 23%. Okay, let's take a look here. And the charge is not in there. Oh, yeah, that's pretty stupid mistake here. So of course, that's gotta be the charge. And so now it's all there. Okay, so that was the easy part. Now comes the trickiest part, which is to again link the prototypes. So we want the prototype property of EV to inherit from the prototype property of car. And so, therefore, we say object.create, which will create a new object. So it will set ev.prototype to the new object, which has as a prototype car.prototype. Great. And so now let's actually add some methods to the prototype of EV. So ev.prototype.charge battery. And this one is a function which takes in charge 2. And all it does is to set the charge to the charge that we receive here. All right. So let's experiment with this one. So Tesla.charge battery to 90. And so now if we take a look at Tesla here, it indeed now has the charge set to 90. All right. Now let's take a quick look actually here at the prototype chain. So let's see the prototype here. And so that, of course, now includes charge battery. Okay. And that in turn will contain accelerate and brake, which is the one coming from the car. And so one more time, this is exactly what we had in the previous lecture. So we had the introduce in the prototype of the student, and then in the prototype of the prototype, we had the calc8 method. And so here that is accelerate and brake. And so of course, we can now use that here. So we can say Tesla.brake, and then through the prototype chain, the Tesla object will have access to that. And so indeed, now it is going at 115 kilometers per hour. Okay, but now let's take care of number 3 here, which is to implement an accelerate method. So let's do that after the charge battery. So ev.prototype.accelerate. And this one will set the speed to plus 20, so it will increase it by 20, and it should decrease the charge by 1%, remember. So just like this, and then we should also log a console, so a string to the console, similar to this one that we had before. So it's going at the speed, and then with a charge of, and then this dot charge. Okay, so let's call that right after the brake dot accelerate, and let's see what happens now. And it worked just fine. So we increased by 20, and the charge decreased indeed by 1. So indeed, it was this accelerate method here that was used, and that's important to notice because the car itself also has an accelerate method, right? So we can see that here as well. So in the prototype of the Tesla, we now have accelerate, but in the prototype of that itself, and so that's going to be the prototype of car, we also have accelerate, right? But JavaScript, of course, used the first one. So when there are two methods or properties with the same name in the prototype chain, then the first one that appears in the chain is the one that's going to be used. So the same is true also for the scope chain. And this is the behavior that makes sense. So with this, basically a child class can override a method that it inherited from the parent class. So if we didn't create this accelerate method here, then this would still work, right? Because then the Tesla would simply inherit the accelerate method from the car, right? Of course, now this wouldn't manipulate the charge, it would simply increase the speed by 10. But it would work because it can still find the accelerate method in the prototype chain. But now, as we have this, then this accelerate method will override the one from the parent class. And remember that this is exactly the definition of polymorphism that we talked about at the beginning of this section. And it might seem obvious that it works this way, but it's still good to remind ourselves that we can actually do this. Okay, and with that, we finished yet another coding challenge, and I hope that now it's really clear how we can have one class inherit from another class using constructor functions. And also, of course, the object.create function, because without it, this would be completely impossible. So great job of doing one more coding challenge. Next up, we will see how we can implement the exact same thing using ES6 classes.